Okay. Now, let me pick up one or two other things out of the postings in the last 10 minutes before we break. Let me start off by talking about slavery. Most of the people who came to the Americas between the 16th century and the 16th and 17th centuries came from Europe and came as indentured servants. They were, for the most part, then people who felt they had got no future in England or somewhere else in Europe. And one of the reasons why they'd got no future is that they'd got no money, no job. And so they came here on the basis of being given a passage across the Atlantic, which they would then pay for by being indentured servants for 7 years after they came. I don't know anything. I mean, who am I to stand here saying this? But that's roughly right, isn't it? You don't know either. Didn't you do this kind of thing at school? Yes, you did, or yes, I'm right, or both? Both, okay. In subsequent centuries, of course, then, a large number of people were brought here against their will because they were captured from Africa by people from England and brought here and turned into not indentured servants who would serve for 6 or 7 years and then be free because they'd paid for the thing that they'd had, but people who were going to become permanent slaves owned by somebody else with nothing by way of human rights and no prospect of freedom and being extremely ill-treated. The problem that we have in understanding the Torah is that the model for us understanding the position of people in servitude in the Torah is one that we get from African American slavery rather than from European indentured service. And it's actually the first form of servitude which provides you with a model for understanding what was the nature of servitude in Israel, not the second. It's the indentured labour form of servitude, not the chattel slavery that is the kind of that provides you with a model for understanding how servitude worked in Israel. It's a terrible shame, and I don't know why it happened, that whereas for the generally speaking, the King James Bible talks about servants or bond servants, the modern translations talk about slaves. There isn't. Whereas European languages have two words, one that means servant and one that means slave, Hebrew only has one word, the word ebed, and that's significant in itself, because the notion of slavery as we think of it, and as African Americans experienced it, courtesy of Britain and America, didn't exist in the Middle East, not just in Israel, but nor did it exist anywhere else. It's only been a European notion. So in the ancient world, it was Greece and Rome that had slaves. The Middle Eastern peoples didn't have slaves. At least no, they didn't have slaves. They had servants who might be servants for life, and they had indentured servants who were servants or debt servants who would spend 6 years working off a debt in the way that people in the Americas spend 6 years working off a debt after they'd had their passage to the Americas. Now, and the reasons that took people into that servitude were quite similar to the ones that took people into that indentured service in the 16th, 17th centuries. That is, they were people, in the case of Israelites, or for that matter in Mesopotamia, whose farm had failed, and so had nothing to eat for next year. So, as a first stage, then a farmer would get his son or daughter to be a servant of another family, to work for them, and thereby to get fed, looked after. And as a last resort, that man, the farmer, would himself become a servant. But he'd do it that way around, not because he didn't care about his kids, but because if he put his kids into servitude, there's a chance then that he may be able to get the family back on its feet. But if he goes into servitude, then there's no future for anybody. The practice then of indentured servitude is a way of making it possible for people who've got into a mess. Possibly it's their own fault because they were lazy, but possibly it's not their own fault. It was just their bad luck with regard to their particular piece of land. It makes it possible for them to be able to get back on their feet as a family with the help of other people within their community who will take them on. Maybe somebody else within their community who simply was more lucky, but maybe somebody else within their community who is either a better farmer or who works harder. But whatever is the kind of logic of that, the system has the potential to make it possible for people to be able to get back on their feet. The system does involve some compromise between the needs of the person who's become poor and the person who's going to take them on. The person who's got to take them on is doing that as an act of mercy, but let's be realistic. The needs, the interests of that person need to be taken into account, and that's reflected in the nature of the laws, which are concerned to protect the servant in such a way as without making it so unrewarding for somebody to take on servants that nobody would do it. There are lots of examples within the Old Testament of permanent servants. One of the great examples is the guy that Abraham sends off to find a son for Isaac. Now, the modern translations, just to confuse us, describe him as a servant. But he's just another Ebed, in the same way as the people who are translated as slaves in Exodus or Leviticus or Deuteronomy are. He is the kind of person who is a slave for life, something that these laws refer to, a servant for life. But he's evidently somebody who is fully a member of the family, fully a member of the community of faith in that story of Abraham and finding a wife for Isaac. Somebody with a huge trust in his master Abraham, and in whom his master has huge trust. So the stories about servants, like stories that come in, for instance, in the Elijah story, need to help us to reframe the way we think about servitude, and see that it actually offers ways of coping with issues that arise in cultures and economies that we are hopeless at. Being a servant in Israel was a much less, at least potentially, a much less tough kind of experience than being a Mexican labourer, being the guy who makes it possible for you to have strawberries for 99 cents from Ralph's this week. That's not an advertisement. Or, for that matter, ways of coping with the implications of the downturn and of unemployment and things like that. One of its assumptions is that the natural way to organise work is that everybody works for themselves. You don't have bosses, you don't have employers and employees. Now, there's a revolution for you. The ideal is this: here's a family, they have a farm, that's the working unit. That working unit, then there's nobody working for anybody. Everybody is simply working for the family. When necessary, that can be adapted so that the family can be a means of absorbing, meeting the needs of, exercising hospitality to some resident aliens, widows, orphans, and the family from the next part of the village who've done badly this year in the harvest. But the idea that then the family in the next along in the village come to be your servants for a period of years is analogous to becoming an employee. In other words, Ebed is almost the word for an employer, for an employee. But what the Torah recognises is that the idea of working for somebody else is really, it's a weird idea. It's a second best idea. The ideal is for people to be working in families, fulfilling God's purpose in the world. Now, if you can reframe the way you think about servitude in that sort of way, then it helps a lot of these laws to make more sense than they immediately do, particularly on the one hand because of the use of the word slavery in the translations, and on the other because our understanding of what slavery is shaped by our knowledge of the nature of chattel slavery in the African American experience here. Anybody want to ask anything about that? Mm-hmm.
I read some passages where God says, like, to restore, if you're a Hebrew national, you get to get your own land back and whatever. But if you're a foreigner, you don't. What's the difference?
Well, you didn't have a land. No, because you didn't have a land. I mean, whatever there's a reason you're a foreigner here, you're simply in a totally different position from a member of Israel who had some land who has now given it up. I imagine it's still, as I was saying about in some other connection about lending, that the question of foreign servants would be very much of a minority. Well, it is in the Torah. It is. It's a very small issue. The big issue is here you are in this village. Things have gone wrong with a particular family in this village. How are you going to cope with it? The question of foreign servants would be a very trivial question, I imagine. But it's right that foreign servants were liable to be in servitude for life unless they could find a way. Well, they've got to find a way of raising the money to buy themselves free. Yeah. We'll take one more and then we ought to split really because it's 7:21. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, it seemed a little strange to me the idea of if a servant was married before.
Yeah.
That the wife would go with him if he was set free, but if he was married while he was under that servitude, the wife and the children would stay with the
right.
with the owner. Can you speak to that?
Well, if the wife was part of the household of the master, then as it were, this new servant can't kind of hijack her. He needs to be aware of that. So he needs to. If you know that's the basic rule, then you're not going to get married to a woman in that household because you know, unless you can negotiate it, that you don't have the right to take her.